Hey kids, today I'm going to be talking about the importance of character. So the contemporary virtue theory has been inspired by the Greek philosopher Aristotle, in particular by his work in Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle was not as concerned in telling people what to do and how to act, as much as he was concerned about who we would need to be able to become in order to live a good or an ethical life. For example, take a case where it's obvious that, you should help someone who's in need. A utilitarian or consequentialist will stress the fact that the consequences of helping will maximize well-being, and a deontologist will emphasize the fact that in helping the person, you will be able to follow the moral rule that is obviously do unto others as you would have done to you. A virtue ethicist, however, would emphasize that offering help would demonstrate charitable or benevolent behavior. Now, going off that, according to Stephen Darwall, many philosophers have realized that Aristotle presents a subtler, nicer, and more realistic picture of ethical life. Aristotle would rather ask the question, what kind of person should I be, rather than what should I do? Basically, put in another way, once we've answered the question, what character traits should I acquire, we can then begin to answer the questions, what should I do about it? Aristotle is also mainly interested in virtues and vices, or in other words, the strengths and weaknesses of character that operate to promote or hinder the flourishing of human personality. Now, moving on to virtues. What character traits constitute a virtue? Well, virtues are personal qualities or traits of character. This can also include natural qualities such as intelligence or strength, or learned and acquired qualities such as relating to temperament, and religious qualities, which are also just known as your characters. For example, it's not enough to be honest sometimes or only when it's to your own advantage, but a truthful and virtuous person is honest all the time regardless of the scenario. Aristotle also posed more virtues than Plato or Socrates. They only posed about 5. These included wisdom, courage, temperance, justice, and piety. Going off of Aristotle's viewpoints, an example would be mainly Aristotle's viewpoints can bring up distinctive issues sometimes. One example could be consider a terrorist who's giving his life for a cause, such as the destruction of Israeli society, and he blows himself up with an explosion, causing the death of innocent people. Now, is he really courageous? It can be argued that the terrorist does not really possess the virtue of courage, because courage in an unworthy cause is not a virtue. If his motive was not to destroy another society, but to fight for the right of existence of a Palestinian nation, then the analysis of whether he's acting out of courage can be altered. But because he's acting out of hate and terror, that does not qualify for that virtue. Now, another example is, say, a Nazi soldier who fights bravely, but he's fighting for an evil cause. It doesn't seem right to say that he's not courageous in a way, because he is putting himself in danger for a cause that he believes in. And, one could say that that is admirable in a way. Now, what is not admirable is, fighting for an evil regime and one that aims to destroy the Jews. His courage is deployed in the promotion of an evil cause, and in the whole picture, it can't be considered a virtuous act. Now, moving on to Aristotle and happiness. Aristotle explains the meaning of happiness in his famous definition as an activity of the soul in accord with the perfect virtue. This definition has spawned many interpretations. The most commonly accepted one that we're able to find is that Aristotle is emphasizing that happiness is not static, but rather an activity. It's something that accompanies activities rather than being a goal of those activities. Happiness, therefore, becomes a way of doing things. Examples, basically, your happiness shouldn't be defeated by the circumstance that you're in. Your happiness should be something that you carry with you all the time, regardless of your circumstances. Aristotle also argues that flourishing comes out of virtuous activity, or activity that causes joy and that has a function, i.e. playing an instrument. It can make you happy, and it teaches you how to play music. And to this, Aristotle concludes that, as human beings, we also have a function. He concludes, that a man's function is that which is unique to humans, and is an activity of exhibiting excellence. This can be shown in a easier way, or a more simpler way, by looking at, plants. They have a function. Their function of life is of nutrition and growth. And what is distinctive about human beings, is the way that, we have ethical conceptions that are located in our own thoughts, feelings, and actions. And we can affect our choices by performing our functions as well. Now, that brings us to the golden mean. The golden mean is pretty simple. I don't really want to overcomplicate it. I could basically put it as, Aristotle basically believed that humans should behave in ways that achieve happiness, and from that ideal, he came up with the idea of the golden mean. The golden mean is really the midpoint between two extremes in a situation. You have your high extreme and your low extreme, and our aim as humans should be to find the midpoint of the situation, because then that's going to be the best for both sides. And this pushes us to practical wisdom. Aristotle explains that well-being and flourishing relate to practical wisdom, and he argues that practical wisdom and those able to effectively deliberate about what is good for their life as a whole, rather than just an expedient. It can get confusing sometimes. The easiest way I was able to put it was look at what's good for your life all around and what will be good in the long run, rather than just picking a situation or a scenario that fits what you're going through right now and what seems to be the best idea right now, because what's good right now might not be what's good for the future. It might not be the best thing for the overall picture. So essentially, practical wisdom involves applying excellent character to a situation in light of an overall conception of what amounts to a good life. Aristotle gives us a difference between a wise and a clever person. A clever person knows the best means to a particular end, but does not understand the ends that are worth pursuing. So although they may know how to solve, say there's 10 scenarios, they could solve one of those 10 scenarios, but they don't know if that's the best act to take. They just see the one that they can solve, and they just go right to it without a second thought. Whereas a wise person knows how to achieve particular ends of situations, as well as examining the whole scenario, picking which situation is the best, and then going with that situation. Now, Aristotle also perceived that practical wisdom should be seen as a type of insight and perception, and the goal to aim for when considering courses of action, unless you're already virtuous in those actions. So what's wrong with virtue? There's a couple things wrong with it. Both Aristotle and Alasdair MacIntyre have linked virtue to particular forms of social life. Lawrence Blum believed that virtue can be linked to your community through literature, as well as learned through your family life. The virtues of loyalty, dependability, and honesty could collectively equate to promise keeping and truth telling. The premise of the golden mean has been criticized, however, because there are situations where you just generally can't find a middle ground. An example would be keeping a promise or not keeping a promise. There's no middle ground. You're keeping the promise or you're not. There's no half keeping it. Another example would be telling the truth or not telling the truth. You can't really tell half the truth. If you're telling half the truth, you're essentially telling a lie. So you either do or don't. There's no middle ground. One criticism of the teachings of Aristotle is that he's essentially proposing that happiness results from moderate behavior. Now, this teaching can be helpful in some cases, because some people can, find happiness without doing the extreme or doing the least. They can, cruise through the middle and just be completely okay with it. But for some, moderate behavior doesn't provide the happiness that you need. Some people, get happiness from going above and beyond, doing extraordinary things, and that moderate behavior is just not going to do it for them. Aristotle is also very criticized for his views on virtue ethics. Now, his views on virtue ethics for the time were seen as very forthcoming when you consider the society that he lived in. But in today's society, it doesn't really work the same, mainly because his view on ethics were from the point of view of the ruling class people. And he wrote the teachings for the high-class privileged male, and therefore his teachings weren't really meant to be transferred to everyone. Pretty much the working class, women or slaves, weren't included in his teachings. And he also pretty much fails when he's teaching ethics. Now, per se, what he says isn't untrue. It's more he fails by by not teaching us how to act, and he leaves a lot of his teachings open for interpretation rather than giving us a direct point to follow. And this is important to think about as a morally sensitive character. It's more important to think about as, a morally sensitive character is more likely to appeal or apply a moral rule of action with insight, and those without good moral character may feel tempted to act insensitively. So a lot of what he says can be put into interpretation, and someone who has a strong moral character may see it, extremely strict. You need to follow this guideline. This is the right thing to do, where someone with a looser moral character may think, hey, maybe I can get away with this, and then they can, be tempted to do something bad, and then they may act insensitively towards someone else because of it. Now, Hursthouse argues that the requirements of different virtues can lead in directions that conflict each other. For example, the virtue of charity may lead you to want to kill someone who may be better off dead, whereas the virtue of justice prevents such an act. Like, just because, someone may be better off dead, say, someone who got in a really bad accident, and now they are essentially a vegetable sitting in a hospital bed. Your better judgment would say this person's better off dead than living a life like this, because, what is that a life worth living? But that gets into something else. But the virtue of justice says you really can't, just go and pick to take someone's life like that, especially, without their consent. It leads to the whole, their last wishes and things like that. Another example would be a doctor who has a patient that barely has any time to live. Now, the virtue of honesty says that the doctor should tell the patient how long they have left to live. However, the virtue of kindness states that the compassion of the doctor should not tell them how long they have to live and just let them live their life, not thinking they're gonna die, because it preserves their feelings and their happiness, and they'll go out living their life normally rather than living their life in fear. Now, there's another researcher named Susan Muller-Oken, and she has criticized the virtue ethics from a feminist standpoint. Now, Oken claims that the ethics were made admirable for free men with high social standards, and it's true in a way. Not that, it was particularly meant intentional, but from the society that Aristotle was from, obviously he's gonna, be writing things for the person that has the biggest ability to, follow these teachings. Therefore, it's gonna be men in the high class rather than, people who really don't have any say on what they can do. She also goes on to state the fact that Aristotle's views in a lot of his writings, especially those on women, assumed that they were inferior, and that he actually calls women a deformity of nature. So we can see through that his viewpoint on women wasn't very positive, and that he wasn't really, thinking of women when he was creating his standards of ethics. And finally, Oken further criticizes Aristotle's claims that, nurture is achieved individually by every person, when in reality, at the time, when a child was born, it was the women and the slaves that provided the nurture to the children. You know, nurture isn't just something that you grow into or that you learn on your own. It's something that's given to you at a young age. And Aristotle claimed that, you know, at a certain age, you get that feeling of nurture and it helps you grow, you know, bigger and bigger. When in reality, you know, it was the mothers or it was the women in the household or the slave women who provided nurture to these children. And that's it. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate it. Bye.